Hello, everybody. Welcome to our June Fireside Chat. My name is Jill Brown, and I am the Programs Director at the Data Visualization Society. I'll be moderating today's conversation where we'll talk about different ways to approach teaching data visualization, best practices that educators can share with their audiences, challenges they often see when they're trying to share their excitement with others, and a whole lot more. So in case you aren't familiar with the Data Visualization Society, we are a professional home for those working across the data viz discipline while leading others into this growing and dynamic field. And we really aim to increase the visibility and value of data visualization to the general public. So our mission is to connect data visualizers across tech stacks, subject areas, and experience. And if you're not a member already, we encourage you to become one at datavisualizationsociety.org. I'll be sure to put that link in the chat soon. So to kick off this conversation, I'm going to bring our panelists on stage and have them introduce themselves one at a time. So with us today, we have Manju, Rebecca, and Will. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Fireside Chat. Super excited to have you. So Manju, do you want to start us off by introducing yourself, letting us know kind of what you do in the data viz space, and especially in terms of teaching data viz?
Yeah, sure thing, Jill. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. My name is Manjunath. I work at Oracle as a director of product management in the analytics space. So me and my team, we're building visual analytics plus BI products for users in customer experience. Those are folks from sales, marketing, service, all of that stuff. But I started my teaching experience in database about 4 years ago. I actually did this MBA program, and we didn't have database as one of the courses. And then I got pulled into a few sessions here and there. Say, can you do this and can you do that? Then I realized, and I went back to the founder and said, look, you got to have this as a regular course in the program, because this was for product leaders, and it was very important for them to understand how to take data, present it visually, take it to the users and things like that. So that's what I've been doing. And then lastly, to finish up, I'm also a student. I'm actually pursuing my PhD right now in operations management, business sciences. I also want to do a little bit of research in data visualization. My guide is kind of pushing me a little bit away from there, but he knows I'm going to do something in this space anyway. So glad to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
Great, welcome. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's great to bring that perspective of kind of being on all sides of the student, mentor, teacher, and also professional aspects of data viz. Awesome. Rebecca, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not wearing quite as many hats. I'm not a student, but I do work full time. I do teach, and I'm a mom. So I guess that counts for wearing 3 hats. So my background is in marketing analytics. I spent about a decade doing that. My job has always involved creating reports, presentations that include graphs. And I would say about 5 to 6 years ago, I became obsessed with data visualization. I realized that our work wasn't good enough. So I was spending dozens of hours every week after work, weekends, just teaching myself data visualization. So I would say I'm self-taught. But from doing that came initially an opportunity to teach at DePaul University in Chicago, where I'm located. From there, another opportunity came at the University of Chicago, where I'm still teaching as part of a graduate program that they have. And then more recently, in the last 2 years, I started teaching at Northwestern University as part of their master's in data science and master's in IT. So a few very different programs altogether. And I wasn't busy enough, so I decided to also start my own company at the beginning of the pandemic in May of 2020. And what we do is workshops in data visualization and data storytelling, but more for corporations and organizations.
Wow, so many hats. I love it. Thank you for that. I'm really excited for this conversation. Will, how about you? Welcome.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So let's see. My name is Will, obviously. I'm calling from Minneapolis. I just moved here in the winter. So I've been doing data viz for, a long time now, eight or so years, I would say, 8 or 9 years. So my day job is that I am the visual stories editor at Axios. So I do data visualization and long form visual journalism for the news. I've also worked in business. I've worked in academia, also doing data viz. And then in addition to that, I love teaching. So I'm also self-taught. So I got my start blogging. So I had a lot of experience just writing about my work. And then over the years, I've turned that into conference talks. Recently, I made a full course on data visualization design. So an online course called The Glamour of Graphics. And I also help run a data viz mentoring community called Elevate.
Awesome. Well, I'm very grateful to have all of you here to talk about teaching data viz today. It sounds like you have lots of different and interesting and varied perspectives. So the first thing that I wanted to chat about and just kind of pick your brains about is your process for preparing to teach data visualization to a new audience. So it sounds like you have different kind of audiences that you talk with, whether they're students in a university setting or colleagues at a company or others who are looking for your services. So can each of you kind of tell me a little bit about that process? What does that look like? How do you prep for teaching data viz, whether that's in a course or just like a shorter format? And I'm happy for anybody to jump in, or we can go around. It's up to you.
I can jump in. I would say I'm borrowing the concept of understanding your audience from data visualization in a way. And I do spend a lot of time trying to understand what the students, for example, would need to do in terms of data visualization. For example, students who are already maybe working full-time have different needs from students who study data science or students who study information technology. So I'm really trying to understand their background, what type of jobs they are looking for or currently have, or type of career changes they want to make, and then try to understand what kind of data visualization they would be using. In some cases, it would be more dashboards, and then more exploratory data visualization. In other cases, it's more explanatory and more presentation style. So really taking the time to understand both their background, but also where they want to go moving forward, the direction that they want to take in their career, and then trying to adjust the content based on that. Having said that, though, I see quite consistently that the bases have to be covered. So I do start with kind of a 101 on data visualization. I just try to approach it a little bit differently based on the specific needs.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to. I agree with Rebecca. It's one of the things that I try and do. So, unlike Rebecca, I have a little bit of a homogeneous group within the three segments that I teach. Like the executive MBA program, these are people typically with 15 years of experience working in the industry. They're either project managers or product managers, people in strategy and things like that, and they're trying to understand how they can incorporate database as part of what they do. But and then the second group is like full-time MBA students, and the third group is obviously all my customers and everything, right? But I think for the executive MBA group, the focus really is to actually start from all the foundational literacy levels. I think this is what Rebecca also talked about. I mean, we look at things around, because these people who come in, they're not data savvy people to start with. I mean, if they were, they wouldn't be in the course in the first place. Right? And so we kind of start with all the basic literacy levels in terms of getting the data literacy levels right. Statistical literacy, information literacy, and then branching into a little bit of critical reasoning, asking what questions you want to ask on the data, why does that question matter, and then we get into technology literacy and then the visual literacy part, right? So that's one of the things that I do, that I, especially for those kind of people who are not really data savvy and they want to learn data visualization, a lot of focus and emphasis is on the foundational components. Because once they understand how they can, what are the different types of data, the scale of measurements, and how they can aggregate and all of that, then the visualization becomes easy. Otherwise, they'll have a lot of pretty looking charts, but then the way they would have summarized or the way they would have used the charts, you'll see like people using line charts with like categorical variables on the x-axis and all of that stuff. And so you try and avoid all of that right in the beginning with these foundational stuff. So that is one thing that I do in my course.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really trying to figure out how to balance like some of these beginner, more actionable tips. Usually assuming that when you're teaching data visualization, it's an audience where they haven't been in the field for 10 years and they don't know everything. So you're going to be teaching some more foundational stuff or some more practical things. So I think for me, it's about striking the balance between practicality and also trying to dispel some of these common like dogmas that you often hear in, when you're first learning like foundational data viz, because a lot of the learning materials that we have and that people use when they first get into the field are pretty like strict, okay, use this chart type for this thing, never use pie charts, do this, do that. And the truth is that I think, after you've been in the field for a little while, you learn that these things are very much flexible and it depends on your audience. What are your goals with your chart, all those things. And so it's a tricky thing of trying to like simultaneously dispel that, but also let people know that it's okay sometimes to rely on rules, because especially when you're first beginning, you may not know enough to be able to choose the right chart depending on all your audience and these many considerations. So both telling people that, but also giving them some practical tips, I think, is what I'm always trying to do. Not always easy to do that. I don't always succeed at it, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. And I imagine the format and platform that you're on also can kind of dictate how deeply you can go into any of those things. So just as a recap, I heard about audiences and really thinking about what your audience might need in their role or as they're learning and what their trajectory is. And then Rebecca, you also mentioned kind of a 101. So everybody kind of starts from the same place, and then maybe you do some tweaking from there based on the audiences. And Manju, you talked about literacy of all sorts, data viz, and topical as well, just to make sure that they're really understanding the core before getting to the visualization part. And then Will, the actionable tips versus, dispelling any sort of rules that might not always apply that they were taught. So I think that's a lot of kind of different perspectives to come at teaching data viz with. So I'm curious, kind of at that foundational level. So I think, Rebecca, you mentioned the 101 specifically, but I think you each mentioned kind of these foundational elements that are part of what you teach kind of across the board. So could you all speak to a little bit of what those elements are?
Yeah, let me go for that. So, I look at specifically about 6 or 7 components, if you will, right? So starting with the whole data literacy itself, understanding the different types of attributes, measurement scales, how you can summarize, um, and then the whole concept of how do you take data, and then how can that lead to information, knowledge, wisdom, all of that stuff. So from there, from data literacy, you get into information literacy, where you try and see, okay, how do I derive information and insight from data, right? So how do you calculate metrics? What does that mean? Why does it matter? All of that stuff. Third thing is statistical literacy, which is the ability to understand what are the different ways you can summarize data and why does it matter? What does that mean in terms of the context of the business that you're trying to do? And explaining it to the users, right? So what does standard deviation means? What does all the statistical measures mean, and all of that stuff? So that's the third part. So data literacy, information literacy, statistical literacy, and then we kind of move on to a little bit around technology literacy. So using the tool itself, and then once you have the tool, can you then think about, okay, now I have the data, I know how to use, how to summarize, how to derive information. What question do I want to ask on the data, right? Because sometimes, I mean, you could potentially ask infinite number of questions on the data, but what matters, and how do you go about finding out what matters? Then how do you work backwards, for example, from a user, try to understand what they do, right? So critical reasoning is the fifth part. And last part is visual literacy. How do you package all of this together? How do you design it? Obviously, there's not going to be always one solution for that a user wants, depending on what the user is trying to. I think this is what Rebecca also mentioned. You kind of look at what does the user trying to do, what insights do they want to get, look at we almost all think of this because the group that I teach with are mostly people from product folks. We almost look at this as a product design methodology, right? Like you try and see how do you design a product. You typically go to your user and understand what problems they have, what they're trying to do, and then you work backwards from there and you design something that will help them address their need, right? So the visual literacy comes at the last bit. So for each of these, we try and build exercises in the first day, for example, help them understand each of these different layers, and then once they get all these pieces, then the subsequent exercises become easy in terms of how do you pick a chart, how do you compare, relate, visualize, all that stuff. So that's one of the things that I do.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. And I want to come back to the teaching the tool question in a minute. But what is the time scale that you're typically teaching on? Because this is a lot of content, at least in my mind, to get through in any given time span. So Manju, for you, what does that look like?
So for me, it's usually a 2 to 3 days full days course. It's like 8 hours a day, and then there's follow-on sessions. So you have exercises, and people have to come back with like assignments and presentations. Ultimately, it's packaged in the form of a story that they're able to bring all of these elements together and then present it in a form that comes across. So timeline wise is usually 2 to 3 days, but then you add a few more hours towards the end for other things to do.
Okay. All right, Rebecca, well, what about you? What are your foundational elements that you're bringing to the table?
Let's see, I can talk about that. I think it depends so much on what I'm teaching, because maybe in contrast, oftentimes I'm not teaching what I would call like, foundations of data viz or how to make charts. I'm teaching things that are more specific, like design for charts specifically, teaching storytelling techniques. So, something that has really nothing to do with charts at all. It's just about how to find stories within data. So I think when I'm teaching storytelling, one of the biggest things is starting with the question rather than the data. I think there's a lot of focus on when you first start out wanting to go straight to the data or finding an interesting data set, and then going from there. But that often results in like less than super interesting revelations. I think it's often better if you start with the question and then go in search of the data. The other question I get constantly is like, where do you find data? Because I think, again, when you're sort of like, if you're going through sort of like more of an educational or a school program or kind of a tutorial thing, it's going to be like, okay, now go to this website and download this CSV file, and here's your data. In the real world, in the journalism world at least, and I think a lot of more applied data visualization, that's not the case. When you say like, where do I get my data? The answer is usually you have to make it yourself. You have to collect it. You have to either perform experiments, build web scrapers, go collect it by hand. And so that's another big thing that I focus on teaching people, is like shifting your mindset, not to where can I find this data, but like, how can I make this data? And then, when it comes to design, I think, let's see, how much time do we have? I won't go too deep into it. I think design is an area where I try to give more practical tips. And so you can go check out my course on the glamour of graphics if you want to know what all those tips are. But yeah, it's a lot of things focused on really the idea of hierarchy, I think, is the key to most of design. So, there's a lot of details that go into that, but in broad strokes, it's, figuring out how to create contrast within your charts that guides people through it in a meaningful way. So a simple example is just something like the title of your chart should probably be larger than let's say the axis text, for example. So creating that levels of hierarchy through size and color and boldness and all these different tools that we have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And what's the time span of your kind of teaching experiences?
I mean, I've done as short as a weekend workshop or like a single day workshop, or as long as like this course has, I don't know, like 50 or 60 lessons. Yeah, it runs the gamut. I think there's a lot you can learn in a very short amount of time. So I try to gauge, the shorter the time span that I have, in some ways, the less nuance there is, and the more it's going to be like, okay, here's 5 practical, really solid things you can apply that will be guaranteed to make your charts look better. If we have more time, then we're going to go into much more nuance about like, okay, here's when you would make this decision versus that decision, and here's when you could go outside the box and all those kinds of things.
Okay. Rebecca, what about you?
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance here. I would say in terms of length, for private workshops, I've had workshops as short as 3 hours, but then at the university, I had workshops as long as 10 weeks, 3 hours a week. So that's what, 30 hours, way more. So the content depends on that for sure. I would say the other differences between private workshops for an organization versus teaching at the university. For private workshops, I typically spend a lot of time beforehand to understand the needs of the organization, and then I would customize the content based on that. If I see that there are gaps in terms of data visualization design, I will spend more time on that. If I see they are struggling with selecting the right chart types, for example, I would focus on that. If it's more about data storytelling, I would pick that topic. So it's really customizable based on the needs, and I would actually check out the work of the audience and run a survey prior to the workshop to really understand what they are looking for. That's a very customized version of the workshop and of teaching. When I teach at universities, though, I typically go from data visualization design, which touches on many things that Will just mentioned earlier. I try to give very, very specific and short tips. And my approach, or what I'm always saying, is that you can literally transform a graph within minutes. It doesn't take as long as one would think. I think sometimes people are overwhelmed. They think, whoa, there's so much to learn and so much to change. Where do I start? And I just want to show them live, like literally live, that it takes a few minutes and you can really, really change the way you communicate information and the way you communicate your message visually. And then I typically go into different chart types. The goal here is to expose the students to more chart types that exist, but also to help them understand what data types go with what chart types, because I often see misusage of chart types versus data types that actually go together. And then I go, in certain cases, when there's more time, into data accessibility. Sometimes I cover a bit of data visualization history, which I think is fascinating, maybe less practical from students' perspective, but I do think there's a lot to learn from the history of the field. And then finally, I go into data storytelling, and we kind of wrap it all up. So yeah, depending on the length of the workshop or the course and the audience, there's some variation. But I would also like to emphasize something that Will mentioned earlier, and I really liked, which is the fact that you should start with the question and not with the data. And I usually start at least one class asking the students, where do they start with? And almost everyone says the data. And then I tell them, well, that's not the right way to start, because you can spend hours and hours looking at the data, trying to come up with an insight, to then realize that you're on the wrong path. Maybe you didn't even have the right data to begin with, right? So then it's better, or a better use of your time is to build that foundation where you actually understand what you're looking for, what question you're trying to answer, what would actually be helpful, and then make sure you have the right data points to begin with. So yeah, that's in a nutshell how my courses are structured and the topics that I cover.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I'm glad that you highlighted with the starting with the question kind of point. I'm taking notes actually and wrote that one down. And I think it's interesting because, people who might come into data visualization through their role. So for example, I was doing research in a grad program for a while, and now I do research for my job. So I have data that I need to visualize. That's the process that I work from. And so when I'm doing personal projects, that's also the same process that I adopt because it's the only one that I know, that I'm like, okay, well, I need to find a cool data set and then spend a lot of time like looking at it and seeing what stories there are to tell, and then answer a question that I find. But this is totally the opposite of that, is thinking about what types of questions you want to answer and then finding the data that either fits it or creating the data, like Will, you said, developing the data yourself, whether that's through web scraping or collecting it or things like that. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important point to emphasize. I appreciate that Gil pointed that out. So one of the next questions that I wanted to talk about that Manju actually mentioned a little bit in when he was talking about his foundations, talking about the tools. So I'm really curious to hear your all's perspectives about the differences between teaching someone a tool versus teaching them how to data viz. So what are your thoughts on that?
So again, the target segment for me, if you look at the people who are, I mean, the ones that I engage with are the ones who are already in the industry 10, 15 years. They are in some managerial position, trying to learn. So the approach in the between the tool and the way to design is, again, I think Rebecca and Will both talked about this, which is you kind of look at who's your target audience, what do they want to accomplish with the viz that you want to make for them, right? So in this case, for example, let's say I'm trying to make a dashboard for a sales representative or a sales VP, then you kind of work backwards from, okay, what is it that user wants to do with this? What decisions do they want to make? What are the different lenses through which they want to see the data in terms of different dimensions and metrics? And how do they want to see? I mean, you just doesn't need to be a hopscotch of different charts put in one single dashboard, but it needs to kind of answer a critical question. Again, there's not just one question, there's a bunch of whole different questions. You kind of bubble up the most important questions right on top, and then you try and focus the entire story on that question, right? So the difference between using the tool and using the visual, at least the way I approach it, is on the latter, you kind of follow this thing step of, okay, what does the user want? And then based on that, what you're trying to present, what are the different data elements that need to be presented, and what are the levels of measurements and scales that you can apply. And then from there, you determine what visual charts will best make sense. And sometimes you'll have more than one answer. And again, this is where the visual literacy level comes in, because a lot of these, some of my users, that they don't have a very high level of visual literacy. Beyond a certain level of charts, they would not, like, you can't take a slope graph and go to a sales VP. Some of them might not really get it. They'll say, just give me a simple bar, I'm fine with that. And so you kind of, but then you take your, and this is something that I learned from one of Elijah's presentations, right? So you then take the responsibility of saying that, look, I can present this in 4 different ways, and each one is going to give you a little bit more insight than what the other one can. And then you tell me, and then you kind of go through that process of educating them, and then they see, oh, okay, now I see what you mean, and then it's okay, I like this better, things like that. So those would be the 3 steps in terms of like designing the viz, and then just the tool just happens to be one of the steps along the way, I suppose, right?
Yeah. Rebecca, what are your thoughts on this one?
So I will start by caveating that I have quite strong opinions when it comes to teaching data visualization in general versus tools. And when it comes to students and to academia, what I see quite often is that students come to take the class, and in some cases my course is optional, in other cases it's mandatory. So there's a difference there as well. But in many cases they take the class wanting to learn a tool. And we do use a tool or two or three in some cases, depending on the length of the course, to practice. And of course, it's great to know certain tools. It looks great on your resume. It might help you land a job, which is good. That gets your foot into the door. But I always tell students, that's the first step. If you want to then move up in your career, knowing a tool is not enough. Absolutely not. Knowing how to use data visualization, how to tell a story, how to understand what question you're trying to answer, and then how to answer that question visually, that's what's going to help you move up within an organization. So I think sometimes students are stuck on the idea of just landing a job and learning a tool and putting that on their resume. And what I'm trying is to present to them a more long-term perspective and to help them see what would take them on what they would need to learn on the long run to move up in their career, which most of us want, I guess, in general. So from my perspective, the tools are the enablers. They help you achieve what you want, but the tools won't give you the answer in terms of how to do it. You need to know the answer and then use the tool to create what you want to create.
Yeah, I think that that basically sums it up. I think, like Rebecca said, it's, to me, tools are like a separate thing from data visualization. So, yeah, I would teach them separately, most likely. I think anytime I do a tutorial or anything which is just focused on principles of data visualization, like design or storytelling or data analysis, I just tell people you can use any tool you want. It doesn't matter how you achieve your result. You can use pen and paper. It doesn't matter. Just, whatever works.
Yeah, I think that's important to think about too. I mean, there's a time and a place. And one of my selfish reasons for asking that question about the difference between teaching data viz and teaching a tool is DVS has a mentorship program. And that's one of the most frequently asked things is I want to learn a specific tool. And we try to accommodate that as much as possible. But there's also a lot more to data visualization besides tools. There's certainly reasons to learn certain tools, especially if you're in a job that only uses a certain dashboarding tool and you need to learn it and things like that. So I think it's a helpful perspective just generally that, the data visualization tool and the data visualization process are not always, inextricably linked. They can be treated separately. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and if I may add something to that,
absolutely.
As I mentioned earlier, I'm very passionate about this. I would say there's also the reverse effect in the sense that sometimes I see students learning tools, and they get really good at using a specific tool, but then they have the impression that they know data visualization because they know the tool. So it creates I guess the wrong understanding of what data visualization is sometimes if they are lacking that background of understanding best practices in data visualization.
I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, that's a really good point. All right. So when you're talking about your kind of teaching and thinking about how people learn data viz, I think we talked about this a little bit just in terms of the 101 or the foundations. And we talked about kind of the progression of how you might teach different topics. Are there any certain kind of practices that you follow when introducing certain topics? So we talked about the 101, but is there certain times to introduce best practices, like dispelling when to use or not use a pie chart or different types of graphs, or does it just kind of integrate more into the flow of whatever course you're teaching or the audience? And how do you kind of think about presenting those types of things?
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit about that, I guess. It obviously depends, right? It's going to depend on what you're teaching and what level they're at and all that kind of stuff. But I think assuming that you're coming into it with like people that are relatively new, the approach that I usually take is to say, like, to, just transparency. So I'll say, we're going to talk about a lot of things in this course or in this workshop, and I'll say rules and hard and fast rules and things like that are useful, and it's important to know them for these and these reasons, and they're especially useful when you're newer to the field for this reason. But just be aware that there's an argument for every single decision. So hopefully you find these things useful, but keep an open mind, and there's exceptions to every rule. And then so then we would go into more of kind of the foundational stuff where it is more rule based. It's okay, if you have this type of data, here's the types of charts you should use, and that kind of stuff, to really get the fundamentals down. And then if you have, then if you're going to move beyond that, if you have time, that's when you could start getting into what are those exceptions to the rules, or just looking at case studies and talking about why you made certain decisions this way or that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say maybe a similar approach. Typically, is like kind of the what, why, and how. So what we are covering, for example, data visualization design, and more specifically, maybe color or fonts or use of white space. And then why. And sometimes there's a lot to unpack there in terms of the why. Why does it matter? It could be, social reasons sometimes, or maybe in the case of color, for example, what for example I discussed a lot with students recently is what colors used for female and male, and then it becomes a whole discussion about the social aspects of it, but then also visual aspects. And then we go into the how, actually trying to show them how to do it, whether that's in a tool or maybe using other tools, not data visualization tools specifically, but other design tools to help them actually apply what they learned. So kind of follow that process of what, why, and how. But I agree with Will on the rules. I like to people typically come in with some preconceived ideas of what data visualization is and do's and don'ts. So I try to first understand what they are already convinced of, and then try to show them examples of when you could break those quote unquote rules. But then also, similarly to what Will said, mentioning that getting to the point where you can break the rules can take a little bit of time and requires more knowledge. So maybe for the beginning, at least, you're safer sticking to those like quote unquote rules.
Yeah, I'll just add to that, in terms of bringing something new to the conversation, is like introducing the audience to some of the advanced tools and techniques that are available today, right? I mean, there are tools where you upload the data and that will create all the visualizations for you. I mean, it will pick out all the different correlations and interesting patterns, and it'll run an ML in the background. It'll tell you what are the different insights in the data. All that is automatically generated, like just with literally with just a push of the button. And you and I and we don't want to teach that on day one first class, right? You want to teach, you want to move that as towards the end as possible, so that when something is presented, they are able to appreciate why certain chart was picked for certain type of reasons, and what are the different tools that are available that will help them improve their productivity. You're in a conference and then suddenly somebody is presenting something. Can you quickly visualize it? What are the tools that are available? You don't have to necessarily sit and build visualizations yourself. And so that introduction to the modern tools that are emerging today is something that I usually time it towards the end of the course.
Mhm. Yeah, it's sort of, for me at least, harkens back to learning, long division and, derivatives by hand before being introduced to a calculator or a graphing calculator. So, yeah, that makes sense. Thank you for that. So in our last 20 minutes or so, I wanted to talk a little bit about your experiences in teaching data viz. So first, let's start with any challenges or maybe missteps or funny stories that you might have when teaching data viz, either to an audience that might have been difficult, or there was a question in the chat about maybe teaching to different levels of experience in the same room. Like, what are some hurdles that you've had to kind of overcome in your teaching practice?
I mean, to be fully transparent, to me, the most important lesson, and maybe without going too much into details, because we all, I guess, make mistakes and learn from them, right? So I think learning is important. But I would say, to me, the most important lesson was to make sure the audience has a clear understanding of what you're going to cover, so that they don't come in with the wrong expectations. So I learned it the hard way, where some people in the audience became very vocal in front of everyone about, walking in with different expectations in terms of topics to be covered. Mm-hmm. So I learned to mention very clearly from the beginning what the course is going to cover and why, so that everyone there who still wants to continue taking the course or the workshop knows what to expect. And then, of course, if they maybe have different expectations, want to learn something else, of course, they are free to not join, right, and to do something else with their time.
Yeah, I think at least in the case of shorter events, so things like workshops, I would say, like, regardless of of what you're told, plan that the room will have like an extremely wide variety of expertise levels, both in terms of their prior knowledge and whatever tools they know. So occasionally, I've been asked to give like hands-on workshops where it's like, okay, we're going to do a little bit of theory and then a little bit of coding or something. And I have to say that, like, it's almost always a disaster. Not a disaster because you know how to like adapt to that situation, but if you would go into that expecting like, oh, okay, these people have signed up for a coding workshop, and so they've must know some basics, and we've been clear that people have this and that installed. It's almost never the case, and so I think unless you have a really ample time, like unless you have like a full day to go through exercises, it's usually a mistake to plan for a lot of like hands-on technical work to happen during a really short time. Just logistically, it's very difficult. So there's ways to get around that, and obviously there's other types of exercises that can be more useful. I think telling people to do pen and paper or brainstorming or different kinds of things. But yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I've observed is this presence of framing bias, right? So framing bias is when, if you present information a certain way, people will tend to believe or develop preconceived notions about what is being presented, right? And data visualization is sort of notorious for increasing that framing bias. There's also a lot of research on it. Like, so an example would be, let's say I give somebody a data set, say like create this visualization, and the moment they see some colors and some graphs, and they're like, I'm done. I mean, I get what is being done there, but can you actually sit down and see what is it that you've laid out, right? I mean, does it make sense? Are the numbers aggregated properly? Are you using the right chart? Even in terms of like dashboard design for some of the executives and things like that, the moment they see something pretty, they kind of think, okay, everything is nice and fine. But then only when you go through it in detail do you see that there might have been some bias that has crept in, right? So one of the challenges has always been that it's not that you know what I'm saying, right? The moment you see some colors and pretty shapes and all that, you feel there's something about that makes you think, like, have a preconceived notion about something, and then you don't really look into it in detail. So making these guys, when they get learning data visualization, to take a step back and say, okay, you have a pretty good visualization that you developed, I mean, thanks to the tool and everything, but just take a step back and see what is it that you have in front of you, and does all the numbers and measures and the way you've designed it and put it out, does it make sense? Is it presenting a story? Are you is there, are you doing cherry picking? Is there something that you're leaving out? Are you trying to steer your users in a certain way? So that is something that takes a lot of time for people to develop, and that hasn't come overnight.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And yeah, I think thank you all for sharing examples and being a little vulnerable with, we're not all perfect, and these sorts of things can be challenging and you have to deal with them on the fly. I've certainly been in a situation similar to Will in the workshop sense, where you're told that people are coming in with certain expectations of doing things and are ready to go, and maybe they're just not. And so it's one of those things that, you kind of learn from as you get through those experiences. But so on the flip side of that, what are some of your favorite teaching data viz moments? And these could be either practices that you do that you really think hit home, without giving away, of course, all of your secrets, or some experiences where students have learned something in a way that just made you feel really good.
Personally, if I think about the most rewarding aspect of my work, I would say that counts long term, because when students learn something, I mean, it might be that they learn it because they want to get a good grade, right? But it's much more fulfilling for me to know that they learned it because they actually developed an interest for data visualization, or even more, maybe a passion for data visualization. So the most rewarding aspect is if I see them down the road, maybe years later, maybe they reach out and they tell me, they landed a new job because of their data visualization skills, or maybe they, they got a promotion at work. They achieved something using what they learned long term. But then also sometimes some of them follow me on LinkedIn. I follow them on LinkedIn, and I see that they publish some of their work. Maybe they create reports within their companies or presentations. And I see their data visualization work, and it's clear that they learned something and they are still applying it. So the benefit, or the fulfillment, at least for me, comes long term.
For me, it's been, I think, one of the things that I can think of, I mean, several, but one of them that I can think of is how, like, sometimes the students, the cohort, acts like the second teacher in the classroom. So you might have the same data file in the same dashboard, you would have presented like a dozen times, but then there's always an observation that a student has on the way it has been put together, that you wouldn't have thought of, or nobody else would have thought of, and then now everybody learns it. So now, me being the constant person through all the class, now I'm picking up new oh, I never saw it that way, and that is a very interesting way, the way you observed it, right? So it's like how the cohort itself is like the second teacher for everybody, and that cumulative learning over a long period of time, I think, has been a very fulfilling, rewarding sort of experience that you pick up along the way.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I mean, definitely just seeing the output of people. Same as Rebecca, like, I mentioned that I helped to run this learning community, this mentoring community called Elevate. So we've seen people there go from like completely beginner, like, oh, I just made the jump into this field and I'm switching from a different career. And, then a year later, they've got like a full-time job doing visualization and whatever. And so seeing those milestones is pretty amazing. And then just like seeing the progression of people. We have channels like, little wins channels, or like post your work, feedback, that kind of stuff. And so seeing people go through that journey, that I guess I was going through at one point, and like seeing the progression and the improvement is very rewarding.
Yeah, that's lovely. And I like what you said, Manju, about learning from the students as well. I think that's one thing that in the experiences that I've had teaching, as well as the DBS mentorship program, is trying to remind everyone that each of the participants brings something to the table. Everybody has a piece of knowledge that someone else doesn't have. And so just really encouraging people to be open and sharing those tidbits that, they might think everybody knows, but maybe they don't. And so I really like that. So just in our last few minutes here, I would like to go around and hear from each of you anything that we haven't touched on that you wanted to share. And then to close out, one piece of advice that you'd give someone when they're trying to teach data visualization to others.
I don't know anything we didn't cover. I mean, I know this session is about teaching. Maybe I'll say something about learning. I think if you are like, I mean, we're all trying to learn all the time, obviously, but when you're in that phase, especially if you've just done a career change or you're trying to achieve some goal, I think patience is key. So don't get discouraged. I think it's very easy to look at, on the internet nowadays, you can go and look at like all the people around you or this person who's won this award or done this great thing or whatever. You see people's successes. You don't necessarily see their failures. So, even like my own career is littered with tons and tons of job rejections, piles of them. It took me several years to get, each new step in my career to crack into the industry I finally wanted to. It wasn't something that just happened overnight. It took a lot of work and it took a lot of luck as well. So, be persistent and try not to get too discouraged during the process. Good things will come eventually.
Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree with Will that, social media tends to create an image of perfection. I mean, we contribute to that. I'm as guilty as everyone else. But definitely there's a lot of work, a lot of nights without sleep and a lot of rejection behind every single success. So yeah, definitely social media is not painting an accurate picture of our professional lives overall, I would say. But if I were to mention one more aspect that maybe we haven't touched on, I would say, to me, part of the beauty of data visualization is the fact that people have such different backgrounds. And you see people who maybe have studied data science or art or, I don't know, music, such different fields. And really, people come together and they develop a passion for data visualization. And I think that's possible because data visualization requires skills that come from so many different fields, right? Maybe business, if you work in the business world, design, you need to understand data, right? So I think that's the beauty of data visualization. And I think that's probably, if I'm really pausing to think deeply about this, that's what attracted me to data visualization in the first place. And I think that's what keeps me going. And to your second question about any advice, I mean, I don't really like to give advice because I feel like I'm always learning. But maybe one approach that I've taken that has been successful so far is to keep the courses and the workshops very interactive, and to use polls and discussions and competitions and to kind of to make it fun. I think learning should be fun. It shouldn't be just, strictly done to learn and to apply and to try to achieve the next thing. I think we should just enjoy the moment sometimes and enjoy the learning experience. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you.
thinking about what can I add on top of what Will and Rebecca's already said. I think a couple of things that comes to my mind is one is I think if you look at the segment of people who are trying to learn visualization where data visualization is not their core skill, right? I mean, these are people who have they are people who are in product management or strategy or project management, whatever be the case, and they need to have this as a competency. This is not their front and center thing, but this is something that they it's another skill in their toolbox. I think needless to say, this is getting foundational. Like if somebody knows like Office, Excel, PowerPoint, like now you need to know visualization as well, right? It's on the same level as competency for people in the industry, no matter what job they're doing, even if they're not pure data visualization specialists, I suppose, right? And I'm just trying to get into that segment a little bit. And in terms of teaching, I think who is teaching, I think the key thing is going to be how to keep these folks, again, for people who don't do database on a daily basis, how do you make sure they don't lose their skill? How do you make sure they're always on top of things? Because if you're not practicing it regularly, you're going to forget it soon, right? I'm talking about that segment of people for whom this is another spanner in the toolbox. So, like Rebecca mentioned, how do we create a structure, a program where they're able to take up challenges, or they're able to take quizzes, they're able to do like submissions, like for example, storytelling with data challenges, for example, be active and get involved there, so that you're able to continuously kind of develop a skill. For people who are not doing database as a primary thing, is the only thing I would say.
Yeah, those are all really great tips and a great spot to end on, I think. So thank you, all three of you, for joining our panel discussion today. I think I learned a lot. Like I said, I was taking notes as well. So hopefully folks who watched live or who will watch later also got a lot out of this. And I think we're going to say goodbye. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and we will connect again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good one.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Bye.